He's a Congress from Massachusetts, and he is a co-chair of Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. And Congressman McGovern has a long bio of his accomplishments and all the legislation and laws that he has introduced, co-sponsored, and helped them enacted into a law to protect the rights of so many people. But he become a symbol of hope and protection for human rights, not only here at home in the United States, but around the globe. And for us, the people of Sudan, he become our champion and our voice. He never hesitated to speak up, criticize whoever in government, whether it's the Republican or Democrat. He speaks to his friends as well as people from the other side of the aisle. And that is how, whenever we called him, he never turned around or hesitated to respond or to speak for us. Continue to, especially the people of Darfur and Sudanese from the marginalized areas who have been impacted by genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Darfur, Nubamat, and the Blue Nile, and the entire people of Sudan. Until recently, he is the leading voice in Congress and within the U.S. government, and as an American citizen who made the people of Sudan his own people. And I am truly honored and proud to call him my hero, and I'm happy to have him join us today. I'm sorry we have a long delay coming in, and if anyone else, he would have canceled his appearance today, but he's coming directly from the airport, and this is a testament to his commitment and his support for us, and thank you.
Thank you, Nima. Thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. And I want to apologize. I was supposed to be here earlier, and I was in Boston. I live in Massachusetts, and I made sure I was on an early flight, a 7 o'clock flight, to be here in plenty of time. And they taxied up to the runway, and then we had mechanical problems. And then they went back to fix them, and then we taxied back out, and then they taxied back in to say that DC National was closed because of rain. So they just lifted the airline stoppage at National. So I apologize for being so late, and I appreciate all of you for being here. And I want to also thank the George Mason University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. I want to thank Genocide Watch and the Alliance Against Genocide, the Women's Law and Public Policy Fellowship Program, the Human Rights Action of Amnesty International, obviously Georgetown University Law School for all their partnership in organizing and sponsoring this symposium. But most of all, I want to thank the Darfur Women Action Group for their leadership and for organizing now for 8 years this incredible symposium that takes such a clear-eyed look at women and genocides using the lens of Darfur. I especially want to recognize and applaud Nimat Ahmadi, the founder and president of the Darfur Women Action Group. You all know her. She is a leader. She is tireless. She is relentless. She is known and admired on Capitol Hill and in the NGO community. And she is not a victim. She is a hero. And so I want to say thank you. So thank you, Nimad, for asking me to be here today and to share a few moments with this incredible group of people. What each of you are doing this weekend, I believe, is incredibly important. Focusing on genocide of the 21st century, I think, is important. Focusing on how genocide impacts women is important. And keeping the focus on Darfur is incredibly important. You know, I represent a congressional district in Massachusetts that is home to the oldest Armenian community in the United States. The first Armenian Orthodox church in America was built in Worcester, Massachusetts. That's my hometown. And we still worship in it today. And when I was first elected to Congress in 1996, we had rows and rows of pews filled with survivors of the Armenian genocide sitting in the front of the church during our annual April remembrance of the Armenian Genocide. Sadly, almost 2 years ago, the last of our survivors, this wonderful woman named Rose, passed away. Those who want the world to forget, those who want to deny genocide, they wait for the last of the survivors to die. They believe that history will be erased with the last eyewitness to genocide. But it's people like you who make sure that history is not erased, that it is not forgotten, that it is remembered, because it must be remembered and it must be recognized. It must be researched and studied and analyzed, talked about and documented. Victims and survivors must be able to tell their stories. They need to be heard and their stories preserved and recorded for posterity. It is the duty, it is the responsibility of each of us to remember, to never forget. And for those who carried out genocide, the perpetrators, those who ordered, planned, tortured, abused, starved, and murdered hundreds, thousands, millions of men, women, and children, they must be held to account. There must be justice that satisfies the victims, survivors, their families, and their communities. Now, I don't assume to dictate what form that justice might take. We have international laws that detail the crimes and the process for rendering judgment. We also have transitional justice where I believe the needs of victims and survivors must be front and center. But accountability is essential and likely unique to each situation. Armenia, Ukraine, the Holocaust, Guatemala, Bangladesh, Cambodia, East Timor, the Kurds, Rwanda, Bosnia, the Rohingya in Burma, the Nuba Mountains in Sudan, Syria, the Yazidis in Iraq. It's not a good list. It's not even a complete list. We haven't done a very good job since we said never again. And always Darfur and the Darfuris in Sudan. This is why this annual conference is so incredibly important. Not just to remember, but to discuss and to strategize and organize around how to make sure that history never forgets, how to hold those to account who perpetrate genocide, how to educate future generations about genocide, and hopefully how to prevent future genocides from ever happening again. You know, we are meeting today during a moment of great hope in Sudan. It's a historic moment, not just because Sudan hopefully will be able to transition into a civilian-led democracy over the next 3 years. It is historic because millions and millions of Sudanese people took to the streets and they demonstrated nonviolently for days, for weeks, and months to bring down the old regime of Omar Bashir. And with great courage and great determination, they seized a moment and created a new and different future. They literally wrote their own destiny. You know, it is stunning what the people of Sudan, who have suffered so greatly for the past 30 years, have achieved. Yes, it was a hard-won victory. And yes, it's still in the early stages and so much could go wrong. And yes, there is a long and there is a difficult road ahead. But none of that detracts from what the people of Sudan have done. So bravely, so inclusively, so nonviolently. You know, one of the gravest issues the new government will need to tackle, either directly or through negotiations with the current rebel groups, is how to address the concerns and aspirations of the millions of genocide victims who have been waiting for years for justice and for peace. There are still hundreds of thousands of victims in refugee camps who have been waiting for peace, for justice, for the possibility to be able to return safely and peacefully to their homes. In overwhelming numbers, so many of these survivors are women. They are children who have grown into adulthood in these camps. I visited several of these camps in eastern Chad a few years ago. When I tried to go visit Sudan, I tried to get access to Darfur. And the Sudanese embassy here in Washington wouldn't give me permission or the ability to travel there. And then I was told, well, maybe, so I was going to Ethiopia and Kenya, maybe if I approached the Sudanese embassy in Ethiopia and Kenya, they would give me a visa and allow me to travel there. And I was turned down in Ethiopia, and I was turned down in Kenya. So I wasn't able to go into Sudan. I was not able to go to the places that I wanted to go and I wanted to see and to talk to the people I wanted to talk to. So I went to Chad instead, and I went to the border of Chad, and the Sudanese Chad border. And I visited several of the camps that were along the border. And I heard people's stories firsthand. And while I was there several years ago, I actually witnessed a humanitarian crisis unfold where people were coming across the border into Chad because they were being chased by militia groups. And some of them were older people who were bloody. A lot of them were younger people. And I watched at that point the United Nations Rapid Response Team kick into effect, which was an amazing thing to see, to provide health care for those who were coming in, who were trying to flee the violence in their homeland. And I remember when I was in the refugee camp, I went, I was introduced to a woman who was in a tent, very calmly telling her story to a group of people from the International Criminal Court who were seeking to build evidence for an indictment against Bashir. But I was listening to her as she was telling her story, and it was being translated to me, and I was just amazed at this woman's calm and her determination to get every minute detail out about what she had witnessed. And what she had witnessed was the murder of her own children and her husband. And I couldn't imagine, being in a similar situation where I could recount in the detail that she did about what happened. And I said to her afterwards, I'm so sorry about what happened to you and your family, but I want to say thank you because what you were doing is so incredibly important. And she said to me that if I thought it wouldn't make a difference, if I thought it wouldn't matter, if I thought the world wouldn't care, then I wouldn't want to live. I would kill myself. I did not, there'd be no purpose for me because I lost so much. And I'll tell you, that episode and those words of that woman haunt me every single day, because it's not just in dealing with what happened in Sudan. There are so many other places around the world where people are being persecuted, where people are under attack, where these awful forces, oftentimes in government, are trying to erase cultures and peoples, and ethnicities. And I think we all have an obligation to use our voices and to speak up for those. Because if I was that woman and I had gone through what she did, I don't know, I would hope that somebody would care. Somebody in the global community would care what happened. And so that's why we can't stop writing the history. We can't stop and forget about what happened. We cannot forget any of this. And there must be accountability for the perpetrators of genocide and of war crimes and crimes against humanity and other gross human rights violations and abuses. It bothers me when some people say that, well, let's just move on. Let's not talk about accountability. Let's not talk about justice. Let's not talk about the victims anymore. Let's just move on to another chapter, hopefully a better chapter. You can't move on unless you address the past. And I've seen that in so many places all around the world. In the 1980s, I did a lot of human rights work in El Salvador. And, and in the last 10 years, many people who fled El Salvador to the United States during the war in the 1980s, I would bump into them at airports, and they would come to my office hours. And many of them came and said to me, I left El Salvador in 1983 or 1984 or 1988 or 1989 after my mother was disappeared, or my father was disappeared, or my brother or my sister. I want to know what happened. I want to find out where they're buried. I want to reclaim their bones, and I want to give them a proper burial. And so we established a program working with the government to try to do that. But before we did it, I went back to El Salvador. And I did a meeting in an auditorium like this at the University of Central America, a Jesuit-run university in San Salvador. And we just said we were going to be there to talk about this issue of trying to recover the remains of people who had disappeared during the war. The place was filled. Everybody was there with a picture of somebody who had been disappeared. But here's the amazing thing for me, is it wasn't just people who were alive during the war. And it wasn't just the son of the mother who was disappeared, or the sister of the brother who was disappeared. There were young people there, children there, who were born after the war had ended. And they were there with pictures of family members that they had never ever met. So unless you deal with issues of accountability and truth and justice, they'll go away. Generation after generation after generation. I mentioned the Armenian Genocide. Every April, millions of people all across the world come together and remember the Armenian Genocide. And sad to say, they do so because they feel they have to, because there are some countries, including the United States of America, that won't even recognize it as a genocide. And why not? Well, because we don't want to get Turkey mad at us. We have a military base there, and we have economic ties. Well, you know what? Our moral, our moral authority, our moral being has to count for more than just that. We have to do the right thing. And so, as we all know, many of these crimes and abuses, were carried out against women. And I believe that women must be included in determining what constitutes justice for these crimes. Because sometimes, even under the best intentions, it's all men. Well, women have to be at the table in this. Women have to define what justice is. And I believe it is essential that the women of Darfur, and the women of South Kordofan, and the women of Blue Nile, and the women of the Nuba Mountains, and Eastern Sudan all must be included at all levels of decision-making in Sudan, and how to best consolidate peace and promote reconciliation and rebuild communities and determine the future of Sudan. We know from experience that women are peace builders. We know that women are best at leading initiatives to resolve conflicts. We know that women must be the ones to design and implement responses to the gender violence that was so much a part of the Darfur genocide and the brutality experienced by Sudanese women. And not just in the past, but more recently during the civil society reform movement leading to the creation of the transitional government. We know that women are needed to help build and strengthen Sudan's justice institutions, and especially for these institutions to operate with a gender lens. So the United States must use all of its influence and its leverage at this moment to advance human rights, the rule of law, and justice and accountability for those people who have committed such grave crimes against the Sudanese people. We have leverage, whether it's removing Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism list, granting debt relief, or providing new economic and development assistance. We must use it wisely so that it strengthens civil society, strengthens the ability for civilian rule to be firmly in place, and helps establish a democratic government of, by, and for the Sudanese people. So we need to make sure that women are central to all of our policies and our programs in this new chapter in Sudan. Now, there's a long road ahead. So many in Congress and throughout the international community are ready to stand with you, to support the critical and central role of women in Sudan and in addressing and healing the terrible wounds of Darfur. Speaking for myself, I have worked in solidarity and support of the Sudanese people, beginning with Darfur, for over 15 years. I'm happy to support your efforts, no matter how long it takes, now and in the future. So I just close by saying thank you for inviting me here today. Thank you for holding these symposiums and making sure that we don't forget. Thank you for pushing elected officials in this country and in other countries in a way that gets them to address some of the challenges that Sudan and other countries, quite frankly, facing difficult situations face. And I just, as a United States Congressman, and as a United States citizen, I have always believed that if the United States stands for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. We don't always do it, and our history is a little bit checkered in some cases. And right now, I'm worried that we're walking away from our commitment to human rights, but I believe we'll get back on track. And I believe we'll get back on track because of people like those in the audience here today who will demand it. And demand it because it's the right thing to do. So thank you so much for having me.